We have the pleasure of learning today with Rabbi Silber. Today's session of Interpreting the Nazir is the second in the series. If you would like to watch more, you may catch us more on Facebook Live, on our Facebook video library. And with that, as Rabbi Silber is here, and it is the top of the hour, I will not delay. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you, Kayla. Okay, so we continue our study of Mishnah, and this whole Mishnah project, which is going to be a very big project. We really want people at some point in the future to do a Mishnah Yomi where people can learn Mishnah on their own, and periodically we will have teachers coming in, guiding and helping, etc. Mishnah is an excellent, maybe the best way to get into the whole study of our what's called Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral tradition. It's one of the real pillars of our tradition, and it's more accessible than, say, Daf Yomi. By the same token, it gives one a very broad view of what this tradition is about, how it continues or picks up from the Torah, and it moves us forward. And we're always moving forward, hopefully. Anyway, let's get back to our topic. So the topic is the Nazir. The Nazir, as we know, is found in the Torah. In one chapter in the Torah, it deals with the laws of the Nazir, which is the book of Bamidbar, chapter 6. The most prominent Nazir of the Bible, and one of the more interesting characters of the Bible is Shimshon. And now the question is, what does the Mishnah do with this Nazir? So first of all, there is a tractate called Nazir. That itself is interesting. Our tradition has chosen an entire tractate to discuss the Nazir and the various aspects of the Nazir, but in doing so, the Mishnah will also present us with a picture of the Nazir that is not necessarily identical to the picture that emerges from the various biblical texts. We'll get back to that later. I just want to pick up with one very important point that I mentioned last week, a critical point, and just to amplify a bit of what I mentioned last week, and that's the following. In the Torah, in Bamidbar chapter 6, it begins with Ish Awisha ki afli lindar neder nazir. If a man or
Rabbi
woman,
Silber, for those
yes,
following along in their own Tanakh, where can they find this?
Bamidbar chapter 6, verse 1. Bamidbar chapter 6, verse 1. Ish Awisha ki afli lindar, it might be verse 2, right? Deber Hashem o Moshe, but the beginning of chapter 6. And it says, if a man or woman pronounces a vow to become a Nazir, the vow of the Nazirite. Now, the first point and a very central point in the Mishnah is that to become a Nazirite, you take a vow, a neder. The previous tractate in the Talmud, prior to Nazir, is the tractate called Nidarim, vows. Now, let me speak one moment about vows, because this is a very central point. We have in our tradition vows, nidarim, and it's a tractate. And we have something else which is very similar to a neder, which is an oath, a shavua. And in fact, there's a tractate called Masechet Shavuot. There's a whole tractate of Shavuot, of oaths, and there's a separate tractate of nidarim. The tractate prior to Nazir is nidarim. Now, what's very interesting is, first of all, that we know that in the Mishnah, there were six parts to the Mishnah. Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, or Shas, actually. Shisha Sidarim. If you remember in the Passover Haggadah, the Echad Miyodea, the song that's often sung at the end of the Seder, who knows one, who knows two. When you get to 6, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. Rechamisha Chumshei Torah, 5 books of the Torah, and 6 of the Mishnah. So there's 6 separate books. And each one is a different book. One is called Zra'im, agricultural laws, including the laws of blessings. There's a Seder called Nashim, that deals with marriage, divorce, etc. And there's another Seder called Nezikin, damages, civil damages, criminal, civil, torts, etc. What's interesting is that the oath tractate, Shavuot, that's found in Nezikin. The oath rules are found in Tractate Nezikin. But the Nedarim rules, they're found in Seder Nashim. So it's interesting. Now, what is the difference between an oath? Because of the oaths, many of the oaths have to do with evidence. Someone owes you money. Someone was supposed to watch an object, and the object is not here anymore. Someone makes a claim. There are all kinds of different oaths. Now, one kind of oath is an oath. I swear I will not eat meat tomorrow. That's an oath called the Shvuat Bitui. Now, a neder, the word neder, nidarim, is presumed by the Gemara to mean that a person says the meat is forbidden to me tomorrow. In a sense, a neder, that kind of a neder and that kind of a shua seem virtually identical. And the Gemara says they are identical, except that in neder you forbid the object on yourself, and an oath you forbid yourself to the object. That's the Gemara's distinction the Gemara draws. And that's a central distinction between the Nedarim on one hand and Shavuot on the other. Now, and they derive this idea that the neder is where you forbid something on yourself from a different chapter in the book of Bamidbar, not chapter 6, but the chapter 30. That's the chapter which talks about a woman or a girl or woman who takes a vow, and her husband or father hears about it and doesn't want it to take place, wants to annul it. So the father-husband has the right to do it on the day that the father-husband hears the vow, B'yom Shamo. Fine. In that parsha, first of all, it's probably why Nedarim is in this tractate in the Seder of Nashim. But what's very interesting is that when you look at that parsha in the Torah, Matot, chapter 30 of Bamidbar, the Rashbam there, Rashbam is the one who seems to be the plain meaning of the Torah. The Rashbam suggests that actually the Torah does not intend to talk about somebody who forbids an object on themselves. Forbidding the object on yourself or forbidding yourself to the object is an oath. The Rashbam says a neder means something different, that in the whole Bible, a neder means I take a vow to bring a sacrifice or to make something holy. The rabbinic interpretation, though, was not so. The rabbinic interpretation is that a neder, like an oath, can be to forbid something on myself, which is fundamentally permissible. And for the Talmud, there are two kinds of nedarim. There's a neder to take a vow to make something holy. This animal shall be a sacrifice. This money shall go to the temple treasury. That's one kind of neder. Then there's another neder, which is I forbid this piece of meat on myself. I forbid this place. This place I'm not allowed to walk to the particular place. The place is forbidden to me, etc. And it's not forbidden until I say so. So those are two kinds of nidarim the Gemara understands. They call one nidre hegdish, where I make something sanctified, holy, and nidre isur, where I make something forbidden on myself. So the Talmudic understanding, the mishnaic understanding, is that neder is similar to an oath, but one is I forbid myself on the object, and the other I forbid the object on myself. But as the Rashbam claims, that's not the plain meaning of the Torah. I'm not getting into that now, whether it is the plain meaning or not. But I think the Rashbam has a good case. But in any event, the mishnaic rabbinic understanding is not so. And then there's a whole discussion. So what is the difference? What practical difference is there between the two? They sound very similar. They sound identical, actually. But there are all kinds of differences. Now the question is, what is a Nazir? How do you view a Nazir? Is a Nazir like a neder in the sense of nidre hegdish? I can say that this animal is holy, is a sacred animal that is dedicated for a sacrifice, or the money is sacred money to be given to the temple treasury. It's called hektish. So maybe a Nazir is the same thing. I say not that the animal is holy, not that the money is holy, but I am holy. The Torah says Nazir is kadosh. The Torah says that, kadosh Hashem. So maybe when you say you're a Nazir, what you're really saying is, I am holy, whatever that means. And practically speaking, what it means, I am kadosh, is I have more restrictions. I'm not allowed to drink wine. I'm not allowed to eat grapes or grape products. I'm not allowed to come in contact with the dead. I'm not allowed to cut my hair. When we discussed in past classes, I'm like the high priest. high priest is holy. It's kadosh. So maybe that's what it is. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe the Nazir may be kadosh, but fundamentally, when I become a Nazir, what I'm really saying is the word Nazir is shorthand for I'm not allowed to drink wine, I'm not allowed to eat grapes, grape products, no contact with the dead, may not cut my hair. So instead of saying all of those different things, you can say it in one word. I'm a Nazir. But fundamentally, the Nazir is I place restrictions upon myself. Same as saying I'm not going to eat meat tomorrow night. Which of these two is it? Is the Nazir what they call the Drei Isur or the Drei Hekdesh? That is a very, very interesting fundamental question which emerges from the mishnaic and Talmudic understanding that such a thing as neder exists. I can forbid things that are permissible to me. So maybe a Nazir is a complex of things that should be permissible, but I make forbidden. Or no, it's the other way around. When I say I'm a Nazir, I am a holy person. And the Torah says, what does it mean to be a holy person? Okay, in this case, it means no wine, no grapes, no contact with dead, etc. That's a very basic question. But my point, just to follow up on last week, these are like basics, but to follow last week, that Tractate Nazir is in the section of the Mishnah that's called Nashim, women. And we discussed last week why that should be the case. Shavuot, on the other hand, is in the Seder Nezikin. Now, just one last word about Neder versus Shvua, which has all kinds of interesting, the Neder is interesting in terms of Nazir. But if we leave out the Mishnaic and Talmudic understanding of a Neder, that I forbid an object on myself, and we go with the Rashbam, that fundamentally it is, it's in the Torah, there's no such thing as that. That's a shvua. The neder is giving something to hegdish. Then the question emerges, but the Torah does speak about a neder. The Torah mentions neder, not just sacrifices. So what is different about a neder, an oath, and a neder, as far as the Torah is the plain meaning of Scripture? What is the difference? So I said one thing: a neder seems to you are creating some kind of situation. Jacob runs away from his brother Esau. He goes to sleep in Beit El in chapter 28 of Breshit. Vayidar, he has a dream, staircase to heaven. Vayidar Yaakov neder lemar, and Jacob took a neder. What is the neder of Jacob? If you protect me, give me food to eat, clothing to wear, I will build the house of God. So on one hand, it's like Hegdish. I'm going to build the house of God. What's interesting about a neder in the Chumash and in the Tanakh, actually, is that it is almost always conditional. Jacob said, if you give me food, if you give me clothing, you protect me, you take care of me, you guard me, I will build you a house. Chana takes a neder in the first chapter of Shmuel, and Chana said, if you remember me and you allow me to have a child, then I will dedicate the child to you. It's conditional. Nedarim in general are conditional, but that's not our topic. I'm simply pointing out, for our purposes, that the Nazirut, is a kind of neder. Now, there's another very deep question that emerges from the Mishnah and the Talmud about the relationship between hektish on one hand, I give an object to hektish, and a regular plain old neder where I say this food is forbidden to me. Maybe in the course of our study of the Mishnah of the next several weeks, we'll come back to that point. It's a very fundamental idea that emerges from the Talmud, and it comes out of the Mishnah in some sense as well, about the relationship between those two things. But when it comes to the Nazir, this is a very basic question. What is Nazirut really? Is it a kind of hegdish? This week's parsha is Kadoshim to you, right? You should be a holy people. What does the Ramban say about Kadoshim to you? Do you remember what the Ramban says? Ramban says Kadoshim to you is not just a specific, it's not specific to any one area of the Torah. It's a general proposition. You should be a holy person. You should keep the whole Torah, 613 mitzvot, that's fine. But the Ramban says, but you can, technically speaking, keep the Torah and be a bum. That's what the Ramban claims. Naval b'shuta Torah. You can technically keep everything, but be a bad guy. That's why the Ramban says, therefore the Torah said, Kadoshim to you. Kadoshim to you. Now, So the Ramban asked the question, what is the model? You should be a holy person. But there could be 100 definitions of what it means to be holy. Where do we see a model of holiness? So the Ramban says, we have a model, the Nazir. The Nazir is somebody the Torah calls holy, and that's our model for holiness. It's a kind of asceticism. There's a withdrawal from earthly pleasures. That's part of what the Ramban is getting at. When he finishes, he brings a sin offering. We'll talk about that later, not today. Says the Ramban, yes, he's a sinner because he stops. You shouldn't stop. You should be a Nazir your whole life. What are you stopping for? That's the Ramban. In any event, so the Ramban sees the Nazir as the paradigm of Kedusha, right? I'm not suggesting that the Nazir has a conditional piece to it, by the way. I'm pointing out that the Nadarim in general have a conditional piece. Now, there may be a conditional piece to the Nazir as well, which we'll hint at later on, maybe. Okay, that's as far as last week. Now, let's begin our study. Again, there are about 70 mishnayot in Tractate Nazir. We're not going to do anything close. We're doing a few mishnayot, but I picked mishnayot which get to the core of Nazirut, hopefully. So let's start with chapter 1, Mishnah number 2.
David?
Yes.
David,
Yes.
I believe there is a halacha that if a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir are walking along and they find a mace on the derech, who is supposed to be matama
And
themselves?
we're going to study that. Yes, that is true. And that's one of the mishnahs we're going to do, but not this week. That's a perek, and I want to talk about that. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's on my list. That's a chapter in the Tractate Nazir, Nazir Kohen Gadol. And you're right, that gets to some really central questions. First of all, you see in the Mishnah right away that the Mishnah sees there's a relationship between the Nazir and the Kohen Gadol. That's what's extremely interesting. The Mishnah has a whole chapter in Masechet Nazir about exactly your question. And there's a mate mitzvah. You have to bury the mate mitzvah. Even the Nazir and the Kohen Gadol must make themselves tamei. And then the question that you raise is, so who should do it? Which one comes first? That's a set of mishnayot in Nazir, which we're going to do. We're going to get, I say, but we're going to get to that. Thank you for raising that, but that is on the list. That's one of the, exactly for that reason. That's where you really have the issue of the kind of Kedusha that the Nazir has. And there's a disagreement of Tanaim, which one should do it. But we'll get to that. Thank you for that comment. We'll get there. That's on my list, maybe in 2 weeks. Okay, let's start with Mishnah Bet then. Chapter, yes.
For those following along in their own mishnayot, that's Mishnah Bet, which one?
Chapter 1, Mishnah 2. Nazir, chapter 1, Mishnah 2. You can get it on Sephariah 2, I presume, right? Okay, let's begin then. Okay. Hareini Nazir, min hachartzanim, umin hazagim, umin hatiglachat, umin hatumah. Harei Nazir. Says the Mishnah. What if somebody made a statement that I'm a Nazir in the sense that I'm forbidden to eat either the peel of grapes, or I'm forbidden to eat the pits of the grapes, or I'm forbidden to cut my hair, or I'm forbidden to be in contact with a corpse, with a dead body. The person said one of these things, not right. Person said one of these things. Harei Nazir, v'chol dikdukei nazirut alav. So the rule, the Mishnah says the rule that if a person says one of these things, the person, any one of them, even though the person didn't spell out all of them, but since the person mentioned I'm a Nazir from grapes or from cutting hair, that is sufficient statement that the Nazirut takes place. In other words, the point over here is about a neder. And the Torah says, Ki yafli, when you pronounce the vow of the neder, you become a Nazir through a speech act. That's a very important point. You need it. It's not just thinking you're a Nazir. You have to say something. And what the Mishnah is concerned about in the beginning of Tractate Nazir and the beginning of Tractate Nedarim, what constitutes a sufficient speech act to create the situation of Nazirut, or in the case of a neder, that the neder should actually take place, that the neder is chal. So the Mishnah says that you don't have to make spell out everything about the Nazir. You could say I'm a Nazir from X, and you are a full-fledged Nazir, and all the other prohibitions would apply to you. That's the first statement in the Mishnah. Once again, it takes us back to the idea of a neder, which is very central. That's one example. Now we have another example the Mishnah gives. Suppose somebody says, Hareini k'Shimshon. I'm like Shimshon. Or I'm like Ben Manoach, whose father was named Manoach. I'm like the son of Manoach. Kebal Delilah. I'm like Delilah's husband. Kamisha Akar Dausol Ta'aza, the one who, in one of the stories of Shimshon, chapter 16, he goes to Azza and he tears down the gate, the shar, the gateway into the city. He takes it, he carries it off. It's one of the feats of strength that Shimshon does. If you say any of these things, or Kamisha Nakru Plishti, or the guy who the Philistines cut out his eyes, blinded him. Harezen Nazir Shimshon. If a person makes that statement, and the person is a Nazir Shimshon. Now we'll see what that means in a minute. So the two statements of the Mishnah seem very similar. You made a statement, you didn't spell everything out. You made a statement that presumably refers to X. Under those circumstances, you are a full-fledged Nazir, or in the second instance, you're a Nazir Shimshon. Now we have the next line of the Mishnah. Ma bein Nazir Olam with Nazir Shimshon. What is the difference between a Nazir Olam? A Nazir Olam sounds like one who's a Nazir. Olam means forever. What's the difference between somebody who's a Nazir forever, with Nazir Shimshon, to becoming a Nazir Shimshon, and a Shimshon Nazirite? Now let me just stop here for 1 second and point out, as the Gemara does, that the Mishnah says, what's the difference between a Nazir Olam and a Nazir Shimshon? But the Mishnah to this point said nothing about a Nazir Olam. The Mishnah said a Nazir. What do you mean, Ma bein Nazir Olam or Nazir Shimshon? Who mentioned being a Nazir Olam? So the Gemara's understanding of it, okay? One could have had a different understanding. One could have understood this Mishnah presumes that if you become a Nazir, you're a Nazir forever. But that's unlikely because in the Torah, it's clear it's not forever. Because the Torah speaks at great length about ending the Nazirut. So the Gemara presumes that the Mishnah is kind of elliptical, that there are words missing in the Mishnah. The Mishnah should have said something like, if you say you're a Nazir from grapes, you're a Nazir. If you say you're a Nazir like Shimshon, you're Nazir Shimshon. And then the words that are missing are, and you can become a Nazir for a limited amount of time, or you can be a Nazir for your whole life. But if you're a Nazir for your whole life, what is the difference between being a Nazir for your whole life and being a Nazir like Shimshon, who was also a Nazir for his whole life? Something like that. And the reason that's very important, actually, is because it raises a very basic question about the Mishnah in general that I alluded to last week. Namely, is the Mishnah really a code to all being spelled out? Or is the Mishnah similar to like notes? Someone's in a class, they take notes, and the notes are cryptic very often, and the notes sometimes skip over certain things. Is that what this is? Maybe this is not a Mishnah to give us the final code. After all, the Mishnah has many different opinions typically. Doesn't sound like a code book. But what actually is the Mishnah? Or even more than that, is the Mishnah a text that the Mishnah, that the compiler of the Mishnah assumes, you just read the Mishnah, you'll understand it? Or is the Mishnah from the very beginning a text that presumes that to understand the Mishnah, you need a teacher? You need somebody to tell you what it means, because very often it's so cryptic, seems to be missing words, that without a teacher, you can't know what it means. Maybe for our purposes, the Talmud is that teacher. The Talmud tries to explain the Mishnah. But this is a pretty basic question. And if it's something that requires a teacher, then actually it's the perfect example of what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, because Torah Sheba'al Peh presumes, and the whole Talmud presumes, that to learn things, we all need teachers. We need teachers that we know personally. We need teachers who have come before us. We have these great scholars who've come before us, etc. So the Mishnah, in a certain sense, if you read the Mishnah this way, that it's sort of cryptic, it can't fully be understood on its own, and it's an invitation to bring us into the world of study and to search for teachers, to search for a Rebbe, whether the Rebbe is a contemporary, an older contemporary, or the Ramban, or the Rambam, or who knows, Rashi. I mean, you have many Rebbes. In any event, the Mishnah says, Ma bein Nazir Olam with Nazir Shimshon. And this is critically important. So I'll just read a couple of lines here and I'll stop the comments or questions. Nazir Olam, someone who was Nazir forever. I take a ned that says, I want to be a Nazir the rest of my life. So I'm a Nazir Olam. So in that case, says the Mishnah, Hichbid Sa'aro Mekel Batar. If my hair gets too long, I'm allowed to lighten it up. I can cut my hair, not all my hair, but I can make it, I can lighten it up. If it's so heavy, I'm permitted to lighten it up. That's number one. So there's a permissibility to cut hair when it gets very heavy. Now the Mishnah doesn't spell out when does it get very heavy. Is it totally subjective? Is there a time frame, etc.? Mishnayot and Talmud in general, and laws and rule books in general, like to have specific definitions. It's necessary. It's also sometimes problematic because what's heavy for one guy might not be heavy for somebody else. But in any event, that is what the first thing the Mishnah says. Number one, that the Nazir Olam is permitted at some point, or periodically perhaps, to lighten up the hair. Mekel batar, you're allowed to cut your hair with a razor. Umevi shalosh behemot. And when you do that, right, you will bring 3 behemot. You bring 3 behemot means when the Nazir completes the Nazirut, then the Nazir brings 3 sacrifices. That's in the Torah. A sin offering, burnt offering, a peace offering. So when the hair is cut, whenever that is, a month, a year, whatever, after that, in a certain sense, you've terminated that Nazirut, but you haven't terminated it. You're a Nazir forever. You bring these behemoth, and then you resume the Nazirut. Okay. V'yim nitma, and what if you became ritually impure? Maybe korban tuma. And if the Nazir Olam became Tameh, came in contact with the dead, then you have to bring 3 other korbanot, 3 other sacrifices, and after them you resume the Nazirut. That's a Nazir Olam. But Nazir Shimshon, but if you took a vow to be a Samson Nazirite, I'm a Nazir like Shimshon, number one, Hichbid Sa'aro Eino Mekel. No matter how long your hair is, you're never allowed to cut it. You can't lighten it up, ever. You can never cut your hair. And furthermore, Im nitma einel mevi korban tuma. And if you became ritually impure, you do not bring the sacrifices that you bring when you become tamei. And in fact, most commentaries presume not just if you became tamei, you don't bring sacrifices. Normally, if Nazir becomes tamei, the Nazirut ends and you got to start over again. But in the case of Shimshon, the assumption of the commentaries, or that I've seen, is that not only if you became tamei, you don't bring sacrifices, but you're actually allowed to become tamei. Shimshon, after all, spends a lot of his time killing people. So he must be in contact with the dead quite often. And it doesn't seem to be prohibited for Shimshon to engage in warfare. Quite to the contrary, he's chosen to be a warrior. God chose him to fight against the Philistines, God's enemy. So therefore, it's not just if you became tamei, you don't bring sacrifices, but you're allowed to become tamei. Now, that's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah distinct. So now we have 3 kinds of Nazirim. We have standard Nazir, who's not a Nazir forever. That's in the next Mishnah. That's the standard. The standard Nazir is a time-bound Nazirite. We'll see if the Mishnah will say how much time, but that's number one. Then number 2, we have someone who says, I want to be a Nazir my entire life. So that person is a Nazir their entire lives, but there are certain leniencies that are effective. In other words, this person is allowed, in the words of the Mishnah, to lighten up, lahakel, to lighten up, to cut the hair. Not to cut all the hair, it sounds like, by the way. It's not permissible to cut your hair. It's permissible to lighten the hair. We'll get to this in a couple of minutes. And then there's a Nazir Shimshon, who's different, who is never allowed to cut hair, but also does not seem to be prohibited from becoming tameh. That's what the Mishnah seems to say to this point. And now, before I take comments and questions, I want to make one comment about the Mishnah, which I think is, this is me speaking. So take it with many grains of salt. But what strikes me is the following. The question is, a question that many have spoken about, what is the Mishnah in general? The Mishnah is presumed to be redacted by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And the Mishnah, if it's not actually a code book, but it certainly sounds, it is a halachic work of some type. It's not simple halachic work, but it certainly is codifying many things. It brings different opinions. And it strikes me, and this is, one would have to say all of the Mishnah and see each tractate, what their particular point of view is. So I believe they always do have a point of view. And it strikes me that what the Mishnah is doing over here is taking Shimshon and saying, in effect, Shimshon is not a regular Nazir. Shimshon is different. When you talk about becoming a Nazir, yes, it's true that the main Nazir of the Bible is Shimshon, but he's a Yotzei Dofen. He's an exception to the rule. He's not normal. He doesn't have the normal rules. So if you say, I want to be a Nazir like Shimshon, you're a Nazir Shimshon, but you're not actually a Nazir. It's taking Shimshon and moving him to the side. Now, it is certainly the case, and we'll see this, if not this week, perhaps next, that the Mishnah in general has problems with Shimshon. There's a Mishnah that talks about Shimshon, actually, believe it or not, but it's not in Tractate Nazir. It's in the next tractate. It's in Sota. The Mishnah has trouble with Shimshon. And I would say more than that. I would say that the issue of the Nazir, and we talked about this in the past, the issue of the Nazir is somebody decides one day, as Faye hinted at before, they want to be the high priest. A woman wakes up, and she's a woman from the tribe of Zevulun. She wakes up one morning, she says, you know something? I'm a woman from Zevulun. I want to be the Kohen Gadol. Says the Torah, okay, you can be, for a limited amount of time. And particular case I mentioned, it could be a man from Shevet God. It doesn't matter who it is. It's man or woman. But the point is, the Torah permits it. You want to be holy, but there's also something problematic. You're not a high priest. You're from Zvulun, and you have your particular place, and you have your mission, and you have your life. And there's also a social order that you're breaking. You're stepping out of the social order. That's the whole debate about the Nazir, good, bad, indifferent, etc. The Mishnah in general, if you think of it as a code books in general, halacha in general, is a conservative instrument. That's what rule books do. They are taking what people have done in the past and they are codifying it. So there's always something about law that is very, at its core, it's a conservative instrument. And code books have kind of uneasiness with people that step out of the code book. Shimshon certainly steps out of the code book. His whole life is stepping out of the code book. His dalliances with various Philistine women, the way he lives his life. So the Mishnah actually, I would say, all in all, wants to make Shimshon an exception.
David,
There is such, just one second, there is such a thing as being a Nazir your whole life. But we'll see about that, but it's not Shimshon. It's somebody else who's also problematic. Yes, Faye.
is part of his uniqueness also that his mother made the neder for him rather than she determines he's a Nazir
I
from
think
birth?
you must have seen have you seen my syllabus, Faye? I don't know. That's another Mishnah, which we're going to do. That's another interesting Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about the Mishnah. What's on my list? There's a short list. There's a Mishnah in Masechet Nazir, a fascinating Mishnah. Ha'av madir et beno b'nazir. A father can make his son, can take a vow for his young child, not a bar mitzvah boy. He's a katan. The father is permitted to place a vow of Nazirut upon his child. That's a Mishnah. Now, that's a very, very, very interesting Mishnah, because if you would have asked me, actually, I would have said, if anybody can make the child a Nazir, it's not going to be the father, it's going to be the mother. First of all, because in the case of Shimshon's mother, okay, the angel informs the mother and not the father. But the classic case of a woman making her son a Nazir, as the Talmud understands it, would be Chana. That's what Chana says about Shmuel. No razor shall cut his hair. That's the example of a person, of a parent saying the child's a Nazir. The Mishnah goes exactly the opposite direction. The woman can't do it, actually, in the Mishnah. Only the man can do it. That's on my list, together with the Kohen Gadol. We'll get there. That's on the list. But that's very interesting, and maybe speaks to the point I mentioned about I would say maybe discomfort's too strong a term, but the Mishnah wants to take Nazir and put it inside, as much as possible, inside standard law. We understand that the Nazir steps out, yes, but the Mishnah, I think, is somewhat uncomfortable with that. Shimshon's going to be put on the side. A woman saying her child is a Nazir is not the case. We will see this in the Mishnah. The Mishnah does have agendas, there's no question. And it's interesting to see what the agenda might be in the Mishnah. So the two things you mentioned are on the list. Those two we planned, that's on the list. Those two mishnayot. Isha ha'av madir et beno b'nazir. I think it's the last Mishnah in chapter 4. And Kohen Gadol is a whole, I think it's chapter 7, either 7 or 8 in this. I think it's chapter 7. And those two we're going to deal with. So we'll have to wait with that. Now, what about this other business of a Nazir Olam? A Nazir, a lifetime Nazir. So where do we have, what is the example of the lifetime Nazir? Now, it's also problematic. But what is the example of a person who says that he or she will be a Nazir for their entire life? So, the rule is the person can lighten their hair when it gets too heavy. Where do we have such a story in the Bible? Who knows? We do have a story like that in the Bible.
Is that Avshalom?
It is Avshalom. Yes, it's exactly Avshalom. So it says about Avshalom, who's certainly a problematic person. And let me just say 2 words about Avshalom, and then I'll take other comments and questions, and then we'll start the next Mishnah. So Avshalom, we know Avshalom's story. Avshalom is David's son who rebels against his father, and who, at one point in his life, he's determined to overthrow the king, to kill his father, actually, and to replace him and to make himself the king. And in the middle of this Avshalom story, we are told about Avshalom, the following verse. Avshalom was the most handsome person in all of Israel. There was no one as beautiful as Avshalom. Let me find this text. 1 second. So this is in the book of Shmuel. Let's see if I can find it quickly. It'll be in 2 Samuel. I can find it very quickly. Whoever finds it should scream out. It's someplace here in Shmuel. Let's see. I think it's chapter 15, but let me just.
Yes, it's 15.
What verse is it?
15 and I want to say 15:7.
Yes. No, it's not 15:7. That is where he says, I want to fulfill my vow. That is an important verse as well. I'm not, it's a verse like somehow can never find. It's here, but for the life of me, can't find it. Let's see.
15.
I'm not finding it now. Maybe it's not 15. That's also possible. What it says is the following. Avshalom was the most handsome person in all of Israel. And his hair was he had long hair. And when the hair became too heavy, he would cut his hair and he would weigh it.
Rabbi Silber, it's 1426.
1426. Okay, that sounds right. 1426.
And it's shared on screen.
Yes, there it is. Yes, correct. The end of 14, not 15. It's the end of chapter 14. Uchiyav Shalom lo ya ish yafeh b'chol Yisrael, most beautiful person in Israel. L'halel miod, great praise. Mikafrad go v'yad kod kodo lo hayu b'mum, from head to toe. He had no blemish. Uvagal choet rosho, when he would cut his hair. V'yom miketz yamim la'yamim asher galech, he would cut his hair from time to time. Doesn't say how much time. He would cut his hair from time to time. Ki chaved olav, when it became too heavy, exactly the Mishnah, it became too heavy. V'gilcho, he would shave his head. V'shakal et sar rosho, matayim shkalim be'evan hamilch, he would weigh his hair. It weighed 200 shekels of royal weight. You get this picture over here, by the way. It's very interesting. What kind of person does this? You don't have a kind of upshearing that we do have, but this is not a 3-year-old child. This is a pretender to the throne. He was very handsome. He would cut his hair and he would weigh it. I mean, there's a sense over here, I would say, why is he weighing his hair? What, to show how much it is, how luxurious it is? There is a sense of vanity over here. Yes, he is very beautiful, but he has like the ceremony. Yamim, yamima, here they translate, he would have it cut every year, which is basically how the Gemara seems to understand it. He doesn't cut all his hair necessarily. It's very heavy, so he would lighten it. It's exactly what the Mishnah says. So the model for Nazir Olam, actually, it's interesting, is another dubious character. It's not Shimshon, but it's rather Avshalom. He would cut his hair. The Mishnah is seeing Avshalom, believe it or not, as a model for Nazirut, or at least for Nazir Olam. And that's interesting. So we have Shimshon and we have Avshalom. Shimshon, we know the Talmud has, I would say, a mixed view of Shimshon, but certainly there's a negative side to Shimshon. Avshalom, certainly, the Talmud has a very dim view of Avshalom. I think Avshalom is much more complicated than that, but that's not for our purposes now. But this is where the Mishnah is getting this idea of, from time to time, lightening up on the hair. This is Avshalom, and the presumption is that Avshalom is some kind of a Nazir. Now, we do know in the verse you mentioned earlier, he says to his father, after he returns from exile, I want to go to Hebron because I made a vow unto God. I want to fulfill my vow. If I come back in peace, I took a vow. If I return in peace, I'm going to bring sacrifices. Now that is very interesting for a different reason. And then I'll stop and take some comments and questions. Because in the Mishnah of Tractate Nazir, the Mishnayot, 9 chapters, and in 2 of the chapters, there aren't too many people that are mentioned in the Mishnah. What is extremely curious is the following. Even though the Torah says a man or woman who becomes a Nazir, if you think about Nazirim, you think about who's a Nazir, I don't think what would jump to our minds right away would be women Nazirites. I don't think so. I mean, thinking about a Nazir, thinking about Shimshon certainly, and in general, do we have other women Nazirites? What's curious is that in the Mishnah, 2 women are mentioned in the Mishnah. And one in particular, another Mishnah we're going to get to, I hope, is about Queen Helena. Queen Helena, Hilni Hamalka. It's a street in Jerusalem, Hilni Hamalka. And so she was a convert. Queen Helena is a convert. She's living outside of Israel. And she says, my son is going off to war. If my son returns safely from war, I'm going to be a Nazir. she takes a conditional vow. Her son returns safely from war, and she becomes a Nazir for 7 years. And then what happens is, in the Mishnah, we'll talk about the Mishnah, then she goes to Israel. And when she gets to the land of Israel, she's informed by Beit Hillel that in the Nazirite vow you kept outside the land of Israel doesn't count. You got to start over again. So she keeps another 7 years. And we'll discuss this. But there you see, by the way, it's the same kind of thing. What does Avshalom say to his father? Avshalom said to his father, oh, when we go to Hebron, Dad, because I took a vow, if I come back to the land from my exile, I'm going to bring sacrifices. Now, what's interesting is that we know that the Nazirite, at the end of the completion of the Nazirite vow, or if it gets terminated in some way, you bring sacrifices. And the question is, and we'll deal with this, there's so much to do, but we'll try to do it. What is the relationship of the sacrifices to the vow? Is it that you finish the vow, and now to mark the end of the vow, you bring sacrifices? Or are the sacrifices of the Nazirite part of the Nazirite vow? I take a vow, a Nazir can't cut his hair, a Nazir can't drink wine, grape products, come in contact with the dead, bring sacrifices. Maybe that's actually part of the vow. So that's a very, very interesting question. And we'll talk about that down the road. But my point is that it's parallel in the Mishnah to Queen Helena. It's exactly what she said. If there's my son, if my son returns from battle safely, I become a Nazir. And Avshalom said to his father, Father, I want to fulfill my vow in Hebron. Of course, the real reason Avshalom goes to Hebron is to make himself king, to overthrow his father. David doesn't see that, but okay. Okay, let me just stop at this point. So we have 3 kinds of Nazirites now, and hopefully we'll get to the next Mishnah. But let me first stop and take any comments or questions to this point.
I know that, hold on, that Debbie, you had a question earlier. Do you still want me to bring that up?
I think David answered that about the conditional thing, but I had something else. It just seems to me that Avshalom, by the hair business, seems to be the antithesis. If we're saying that you're not supposed to be vain and you're supposed to be, you mentioned the word asceticism and you mentioned removal from life. And I always look at it as focusing on the inner and on being a Kohen Gadol and not being interested in the outer. Avshalom seems to typify the opposite totally. If he's weighing his hair, he's really, what we said about Yosef, misalsel basaro,
Right. No, there's no question. I mean, I think one can see Avshalom. I mean, there's no real sense in the book of Shmuel that Avshalom is a Nazir.
Right.
I think the Mishnah is reading this into Avshalom, and you're right, it's probably somewhat of a critique, but I do think it fits in a certain way, not what I discussed the last set of classes about the Nazir of the Bible having a mission. I mean, in my book, I wrote a book called Machut Adam, which is written in Hebrew. I like the book very much. And it's written, I didn't write it, it's written by Ben Zion Ovad. He writes a beautiful Hebrew, and not an easy Hebrew either. But the position I took in the book about Avshalom, which I strongly believe in, is that Avshalom actually starts off as a kind of hero. I mean, one person who's going to care for his sister.
Right.
He gives his father time to do the right thing. His father does not step in. It's more complicated, but fundamentally, what Avshalom is the one who should succeed David. He's the right guy. What happens is that basically through King David's failure to do justice and to do the right thing, Avshalom turns against his father. And then in succeeding stories, he's presented more and more negatively. I'll put it this way. When David's little child born from Bathsheba dies, when he dies, David doesn't mourn. He mourns before, but he doesn't mourn afterwards. With Avshalom, it's quite the opposite. B'ni, Avshalom, B'ni. And David knew something that most readers of this book don't understand. He understood with the death of Avshalom, he never finds the right successor. There is no right successor to David in the plain reading of the Bible, including Solomon, who David has no interest in, obviously. He's tricked into making him tricked or convinced or cajoled or whatever, but he has no interest in Shlomo. He has certainly no interest in Adoniah. The right guy is dead. The right guy is Avshalom. So Avshalom is in the book of Shmuel, in my reading of it. No one else seems to say this, but
So
I'm
that's
quite
the
convinced
tragedy.
it's right.
That's
Tragedy,
the
which
tragedy.
David understood well. He understood Avshalom. I wish I had died in your place, but that he meant you should be my successor. And David understands, presumably, that the failure of Avshalom is his own failure, but it's never just his failure. It's the failure of David, actually. And it comes right after the story of David and Bathsheba. He's not in a place where we can tell Amnon, you don't misbehave sexually, because Amnon would say, Dad, I'm just following your footsteps. I mean, I'm doing what you did. That's
He
the
would point
problem
the
with
finger at
misbehavior.
him. Right.
So that's largely David's fault, but David understands it, which is why the uncontrollable, he still believes that Avshalom can be. It's too late. David, it's not going to happen. But anyway, but it's interesting about the Mishnah. In any event, it doesn't mention Avshalom in the Mishnah. We say Mekel Batar. That's Avshalom. That's exactly what he does. His hair is too heavy. Hechibid Saro. So the Mishnah is already alluding to Avshalom. So that's a Nazir Olam. And I will say that I think one can read in the Mishnah, if this is correct, a critique of becoming a Nazir Olam. The Mishnah doesn't like a Nazir Olam. The Mishnah accepts the idea of a Nazir, but only on a time-bound, temporary basis. Is there anybody else who wants to say something? And otherwise, we'll just continue with the next Mishnah.
Faye, I saw you had a hand up.
Yeah, David, you mentioned the whole institution of Neder and Nedarim and the famous Neder by Yaakov. And I don't mean to be heretical, but it almost sounds like a Avodah Zarah. Listen, God, if you do this, I'll give you this. That doesn't sound like a spiritual prayer or a spiritual interaction. It sounds like transactional. So
right. Yeah, my understanding of that story is a little different. In other words, my understanding is, I think there's a long answer and a short answer. First, I would say two things about Yaakov's neder. It does sound transactional, but you can understand it in the following way. Look, I want to serve you. That's what Yaakov says. I want to be your servant. And I would add, but Yaakov is saying more than that. I want to be your servant. I want to be your servant in my own way, not just as the child of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham, but I want to do something no one else has ever done, which is to build the family, to build a house, which Yaakov does. Everybody gets included with Yaakov. No one's excluded. That's what Yaakov does. But I would say more than that. Yeah, what Yaakov is saying is, look, I want to be your servant. I want to do the right thing. But but you have to give me the wherewithal to do it. What we say in our davening, I want to be an Eved Hashem. But if I'm sick all the time, I can't do it. I need good health. If I make terrible decisions, I can't do it. Give me wisdom. If I live in a place where I can't walk out the door because it's not safe, I can't do it. If I'm, etc. So the Shemona Esrei, we're asking for the things that allow us to be God's servant. That's my understanding. Yaakov says, if I'm stuck in exile, if I'm starving to death, I have no food, he's not asking for a lot. He's asking, I just need a coat and I need a meal. And if you do that for me, if you make it possible, I want to serve you, but you have to help me here. Help me out, That's my understanding. I don't see it in a negative way, actually. I know some do, but I don't see it that way. Plus, he's saying something else. I am your servant. I'm Isaac's son. I'm Abraham's son. But I want to do something they could not do, and they can't. They always choose one person. Abraham chooses Isaac. Isaac chooses Yaakov. Says Jacob, I want to choose all the bayit. That's the family. Calls his house is bayit. So I think it's not transactional. But yes, it is. There is a conditional side to it. Otherwise, I can't do it. That's true. Chana says it too. I want to serve you. I want to change the world. My son will change the world. Give me a child. I can't do it myself, she says, but give me a child. All right, let me make one more point here about this. One more line in the next Mishnah, Mishnah Gimel, just the 4 words. Stam Nazirut Shoshim Yom. 4 words, Mishnah Gimel. Very, very important Mishnah. Stam Nazirut Shoshim Yom. What does that mean? Means if someone says, I want to be a Nazir, that's Stam Nazirut, unspecified. What is the rule if someone says, I want to be a Nazir? So the Mishnah starts off with these 4 words. You want to be a Nazir, you're a Nazir for 30 days. That's the amount of time, it's 30 days. Now, the Mishnah doesn't tell us why 30 days. I will point out, by the way, that the idea of Stam X 30 days is not in the Talmud, not confined to a Nazir. For example, the Gemara says in Bava Batra, not sure it's in the Mishnah, it's in the Gemara. I remember from the Gemara, Stam halva shloshim yom. I say to you, lend me some money. Please lend me money. I don't specify the amount of time, and the loan is the duration of the loan. The Gemara says in Bava Batra, Stam halva shloshim yom. If I don't specify the loan, how much time? 30 days. 30 days is a standard amount of time. It's also, the Gemara will talk about the amount of time that you can say that you've grown your hair so that the hair is longer, which is 30 days. But my point is, Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom, I think is a very important statement. And it fits in well with what we've seen so far, which is, says the Mishnah, listen, Nazirut Stam, if it's unexceptional, it is a very limited amount of time. It's not a lifetime, it's not a year. It's not half a year, it's 30 days. So 30 days is, I would say, the minimum, because the Torah says you have to grow your hair. So if you say, I'm a Nazir for a week, have you really grown your hair? You can't really. But 30 days, the Gemara will assume that 30 days is the amount of time that one can say that one's hair has grown, Gadel Pera. Because apart from the restrictions of the Nazir, the Torah says the Nazir should grow the Nazir's hair. So 30 days. But my point about Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom, and we'll discuss this, the aspects of this rule. But it's interesting. It's a broader rule than you might think. The Mishnah will spell it out. We'll start with that next week, and then we're going to jump to. We have 4 more mishnaic, 4 more classes after this. I do want to deal with the question of the Kohen and the Nazir, and I want to talk about the Mishnah about a parent saying the child is a Nazir. Those are actually 2 mishnaic that Faye mentioned. And then there's other things to speak about as well. And then the rules of the Nazir, we want to get into that to some extent. And then how the Mishnah sees who is the ideal Nazir. That's another that emerges from the Mishnah. But Stam Nazir Shloshim Yom is a very broad idea. But the core of it, I think, is understand what the Chumash says. But the Chumash spends more time describing how you end the Nazirite vow than it does describing the Nazirite vow. There's a whole discussion about how you end the vow, which sacrifices you bring, the cutting of the hair, etc., etc. So we'll talk about all that next week, actually. So Stam Nazirut, says the Mishnah, listen, you could be a Nazir forever, Nazir Shimshon, Nazir for many days, but if you say I'm a Nazir, there are only 30 days. At the end of 30 days, it is over. And we'll see next week that actually there's a difference, though, between saying I'm a Nazir, and I'm a Nazir for 30 days. That actually it's a different rule for those two. We'll get to that next week. That's another really interesting concept that emerges from the Mishnah. I guess we'll have to stop at this one. Are there any other comments or questions before we stop?
Just one other. The Nazir says, I'm not going to have great products, I'm not going to cut my hair, and so forth and so forth. But it doesn't talk about his kavana. Oh, okay, so I'm not going to eat this. I'm not going to do that. Doesn't mean I'm in a spiritual head that makes me competitive with a Kohen Gadol. There's no speaking to the kavanah behind the neder.
That is true. We don't know what the person is thinking, actually, and that emerges from the Mishnah doesn't talk about that. I mean, generally speaking, the only issue comes up in the Mishnah is, was the person's intention to be a Nazir? But why the person wants to be a Nazir, the Mishnah never really discusses this. There is a story in the Gemara that talks about the Shimon HaTzadik, that he took a dim view of Nazirites till one time he met this particular person. But you're right, the Mishnah is, as I say, the code books in general steer away from intentions and deal much more with actions, behaviors. What constitutes a speech act? That's what the Mishnah, you have to think of the Mishnah as a kind of code book, even though it's not exactly that, but it certainly has that aspect to it. But we'll come back to that later on. I mean, there is the larger question of what did the Mishnah think about Nazirim in general, right? That's true. And I think the Mishnah has mixed feelings about the Nazir in general, but we'll talk about that down the road. But Stam Nazirut by its core nature is a very temporary situation. That's what the Mishnah seems to be saying over here. But we'll talk more about the further aspects of this. Okay, so we'll stop at this point. If anybody has any other questions, you can always email me, dsilber@risha.org. Good to learn with you. All this is in memory of Rifka Rosenwein, all these classes. And the Mishnah project is one that is near and dear to Grisha's heart and to my heart personally. I think it's a great way for people to get into the study of Torah Shabbat Peh. Okay, so we'll stop at this point and thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank
See
you
you all
very much.
hopefully next week. If you'd like to learn more with Risha, our next class coming up is Conversations on the Parsha, a rotating discussion of each week's Parsha. This week, Achrei Mot Kedoshim with Rabbi John Kelson and Michael Bernstein. And it's also, if you are interested in joining us for some summer learning, our applications for our summer kollel are still open until up through May for both in person in New York City and virtual options. If this sounds like an option, something you'd be interested or someone in your life would be interested in, please check out our website. And with that, have a good day, everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Take care.